I have with me a very dear friend and colleague, an American Muslim whom I've known and admired for perhaps 15 years now, is it?
15 years
that we first met. He's here on a lecture tour in England, very briefly, and I'm going to ask him a few questions about Islam and Muslims in the West, but focusing particularly on how we get this most precious of commodities, ilm. How do we become scholars, or how even nowadays do we find scholars? Many people, including I think Sheikh Hamza, believe that they are something of an endangered species. So how is it that young Muslims in the West particularly can overcome this obstacle? We don't have proper institutions of our own. So can we travel to the Islamic world? Should we do it the traditional way, by sitting at the feet of ulama? Or should we put our faith in these great new Islamic universities that are appearing in all sorts of countries? Anyway, perhaps Sheikh Hamza, if I could start with that. I know that you've been perhaps one of the last true advocates of the traditional practice of al-rihla fi talab al-ilm. We know that the great medieval ulama, from Imam al-Bukhari to so many of the great scholars, even in the 19th century, almost spent all of their lives travelling. You know, they would have, like Ibn Sina was well known for having 1,000 camels who would carry his books wherever he went. And you somehow, in this age of mass communications, seem to be trying to maintain this tradition. Why do you think that's necessary when we have Islamic universities? Why should we go and find a scholar in, say, the depths of Mauritania, where I gather you've been, rather than going to a new university and studying in one place?
I think it's interesting that you brought that up, the idea of rahla, and it's certainly something that classical scholars often wrote books called al-rihla.
Yes, indeed.
And they would talk about their experiences traveling and the importance of actually leaving one's place of birth. In fact, Imam al-Junayd, the famous scholar and what they call him, the Imam of the Ta'ifatain, the two groups, because he was both a scholar, but he was also a deeply spiritual man and a spiritual educator. He talks about that a man's iman really is complete when he enters into a state of ghurba, which is estrangement from one's own land. And I think he's getting that from the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Muslim, that Islam began a strange thing and it returns a strange thing, and he said, blessed are the strangers. And gharib, as you well know, is one of the meanings, is to be in a strange land where you're not from. And so the idea of going out is really you become gharib, and that in itself is a spiritual station in Islam, to be a gharib. And what you do is attempt to find kindred spirits. And I think also there is a blessing, I found that there is a blessing in setting out, because there is a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, من سلك طريقا يلتمس فيه علم فهو في سبيل الله حتى يرجع. Whoever sets out on a path, and salak is suluk, whoever sets out on a path seeking knowledge is in the path of God. In other words, like a mujahid, somebody struggling in the path of God until he returns. And then there's another tradition that says that Allah has taken it upon himself to provide for the seeker of knowledge. So I think one of the wonders for me of literally setting out was to see that, you know, my provision came from places unexpected, because I really, when I went out, I did not have the money, I didn't really have the means to take care of myself, and yet I saw just really wondrous things happen without ever being forced to ask or beg, even though the traditional scholars consider that acceptable for a seeker of sharic knowledge to ask wealthy people to help them while they were seeking knowledge. It really never became an issue with me. So I just think there's a lot of great benefits in doing that. It's kind of setting out literally into the world and trusting in Allah, and inshallah with the noblest of intentions, which is to acquire knowledge.
You must have met some extraordinary people during our travels.
Right.
Do any particular experiences or individuals stand out in your memory?
I think we've met, we share some common remarkable people that we've met, and this is another one of the blessings, is that we are in an age I mean, I liken this age to, in terms of what a human being is, I think in a lot of ways we're to point to people now and say this is human society, this is what human beings are, for me is like somebody going to into a room with a decrepit old man on a bed, like 80 years old, and literally defecating and urinating in his own bed and completely incapacitated, to say that this is a human being. In other words, not to recognize that it was once a young man in his youth and vigor. And in a lot of ways the age we're living in is like that. It is that the state of human beings is really so horrifying. So going out and literally seeing individuals that still represent, Bani Adam, the Adamic man and the Adamic woman, and they still exist, but unfortunately many of them are literally hidden. Sayyidina Ali said that people, in a tradition that Al-Qada'i relates, that people will always, Allah will always have His hujjaj, His proofs on the earth. And he said either Azizun Zahir, either outwardly in a state of dignity and strength, or Khaifun Maghmur, or obscured and hidden out of fear. And unfortunately this is that type of age where people's adab, their spiritual manners have become so detestable that a lot of really righteous people, out of a mercy really to the ummah, have withdrawn because of the hadith, whoever is harmful of a friend of mine, I declare war on him. And so for that reason many of the scholars have said that in times of great distress, oftentimes the people of Allah will literally they'll disengage from the society until conditions change. So that for me was a great blessing. Murabt al-Hajj, the man that I studied with in Mauritania, lives in the middle of the Saharan desert, and it wasn't just his knowledge. I mean, like Imam Malik's mother said to Malik radiallahu anhu when he went as a child to Ibn Hurmuz, learn from his courtesy before you learn from his knowledge. And just seeing this man, it's one thing to read about the ancients and to read about people that spent their nights in prayer, like Abu Hanifa, praying Fajr with the wudu of Isha for 40 years or something like that. We can read these, hagiographies about these great awliya and things like that. But to actually see a human being that embodies that is really shocking, because what you realize is these aren't mythologies that we're reading about, that these people did exist. And that is something for me that I think that's one of the greatest benefits that I have gotten from meeting these people, is to realize, one, that the potential of a human being, what we can rise up to, and two, to recognize that our path, the path of Islam, is a path that elevates and dignifies and exalts the human being.
This is something that's so difficult for particularly young people, I think, brought up in the West, isn't it? Because the educational matrix here stresses so much the imparting of information and the ability to make one's own independent judgment on the basis of that information. But the idea of education as being a process of osmosis, whereby you're not just packed with facts, but your potential as Allah's Khalifa on the earth, as a sort of beautiful, dignified, compassionate being, something that you learn from teachers or learn from your society, that's never stressed whatsoever.
No.
And I've noticed a lot of young Muslims in England, they have not just lost, in many cases, the traditional beautiful adab, the politeness, the compassion, the way of being, the metabolism of the traditional Muslim, because of the schools they've been brought up with, but they've even lost any access to individuals who can help them to recover that. You can learn from books, but as you well know, you can't really learn Islam from a book. You have to learn it from a human being.
Right.
The Sahaba didn't learn Islam from a book, they learned it from the radiant presence of the Prophet, who somehow in 23 years of his presence took them out of Stone Age barbarism and the worship of idols and most crude magical practices you could imagine, and turned them into these radiant saints, 100,000 of them, who proceeded to go out and
change the world,
change the entire world. 23 years just of his presence had that effect. And the ulama traditionally have tried to be heirs of that tradition and try and pass on some of that light that they've gained from their own teachers in a continuous chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ. I always thought that one of the most astonishing things I encountered in studying with, as I occasionally did, real traditional hadith scholars was this institution of al-hadith al-musalsal, which you almost don't believe when you read about it in the classical text,
right.
that somebody cannot just say, oh, this hadith is narrated in Bukhari with such a narration, and this hadith is narrated by Dailami or someone with another narration, and I have my own isnad for it, and then the scholar sits down, and I've seen them do this.
Right.
They said, حدثني الوالد رحمه الله عن الشيخ فلان عن الشيخ فلان, and they mention perhaps 18 or 20 or 25 people,
right.
going right back to the Prophet ﷺ, and they know all of these individuals, and you see in that chain great scholars like Imam Ibn Hajar,
right.
and Imam Suyuti, and you see their own teaching didn't die with their death but continues today. That's one of the most impressive experiences I think that I ever had during my unfortunately few encounters with real traditional hadith scholars. But of course it's vanishing, and one of the great problems we have is that the ulama are getting old, and the younger generation have no access to them, and there are no institutions and channels whereby the wisdom and also this sense of being of the older generation can be transmitted to the new generation of Muslims. I don't know what your opinions are of the Islamic universities that have been popping up in various Islamic countries. I studied for a while at Al-Azhar, and the Azhar was unfortunately nationalized by Nasser, who almost closed it down. But one of the nasty things he did was to abolish the traditional system of Azhari education, whereby every student was attached to a particular sheikh, somebody who would be responsible for making sure that he went to the right classes, that he was making good progress, and that also his sort of moral and spiritual conduct was being improved constantly. Every single student in the Azhar had a sheikh, and sometimes they were quite terrifying sort of headmasterly figures with big sticks, and then people were scared of them. But the Azhar produced whole regiments of scholars for the entire ummah, who are not just bearers of knowledge but also bearers of the beautiful adab of Islam. But Nasser abolished that, and he put all of the students, particularly the non-Egyptian students, in this great concrete encampment on the outside of Cairo, and he actually demolished a cemetery and built this student hostel on top of it, 4,000 students there. And they just play around. Some of them are listening to pop music, some of them are
It's quite appropriate
around.
that he built it over a cemetery.
Yeah. And the environment there is, occasionally they come back with a certain amount of knowledge, but they do not go back with the sort of wisdom and the bearing of the traditional Muslim, and that has been lost. So I don't know if you think that that's the problem with all of the Islamic universities, or whether there are perhaps some exceptions.
I think that we had the madrasa system is a fascinating system. The word itself, madrasa, is not only does it mean the place of a lesson, like it's the noun of place in Arabic, but also darasa, which means to be effaced. It has the idea of, darasat al-athar, the traces literally disappeared, and part of the madrasa was that the ego or the nafs was effaced.
That's right.
The crude, the jewel, literally what the teachers were doing were carving. In fact, they say التعلم في الصغر كالنقش في الحجر, that teaching a youth is like carving in stone. And this is really what they were doing, was taking this jawhar, this essence that has the coal around it, and chiseling away all of this black coal until you have this diamond, this precious jewel that then can go out and literally illuminate, like you said, and transform the places where they came from. But the system was beautiful in that you had literally small madrasas all over the ummah, and the youth of the villages would study in these kutab, and would memorize the Quran and memorize basic mutun, the texts like in al-Bayquniya and the Hadith, and Ibn Ashar, for instance, in Morocco and North Africa in basic fiqh. And then they would take the extremely bright students from that group that showed great promise, and they would be then sent to the major areas of learning, like in Morocco it would have been Fes. So the Mauritanians, the scholars of the Sahara, would study in the madrasas there, which are now considered these producing these great ulama, and they're the first to admit that they're not ulama, that this system that they had was really a preparatory school for the real universities of Islam. And so they would go then to Fez, to Zaytuna, to Tlemcen, to Al-Azhar, to the Nizamiya schools, Baghdad, Syria, the Qayyumiyya, all these different, or the Jawziyya, all these different schools, and there they would, after memorizing quite a considerable amount of textual material, they would learn not only the adab, but also how to literally take this material and apply it with intelligence contextually. And this is something that my experience of the Muslim world is that we have people that oftentimes learn a considerable amount of information. It's certainly there's in the Muslim world there's much more an emphasis still on rote memorization than say the Western universities now, which teach more learning kind of theories and understanding how things work and are formulated, rather than having the rote that you can keep your calculator to plug in, but just understand how the thing works. But despite that fact, what I'm witnessing, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, but what I'm seeing is that we have yet to deal with the issues of our age. We have yet to be able to take the Islamic, all of this massive amount of information, and literally apply it to the age we're living in terms of dealing with the issues of the age and healing the diseases of the age, because that's what it was sent down for. And I think it's like the story about the student who stayed with the sheikh for years, and the sheikh used to go and he would do the ruqya on the people and read Fatiha and then use his spittle, and they would get well usually immediately. And when the sheikh died, they went to the student, and so the student read the Fatiha and put the spittle on the person. Nobody got well, and they asked him, well, what's the matter? And he said, well, the Fatiha is still the same, but I think the spittle's changed. So I think this is part of our problem, is that the information's all still there, but the men and women that possess the wisdom, because in the Quran when Allah says لِيُعَلِّمُهُمَ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, that it wasn't simply the book that was to be taught, but also the wisdom in order to implement the book contextually, because this is something a lot of Muslims, especially our youth, don't understand, is that a great deal of our literature is contextual. And the Muslims understood this long before Wittgenstein and linguistics theories of contextual, the contextual nature of language, that the hadiths, many of the hadiths are contextual, and you can't simply take a hadith and apply it universally.
There's a whole science of asbab al-wurud.
Asbab al-wurud, exactly.
Dropped from the curricula of a lot of Islamic institutions, I've noticed, which is a very peculiar development. But it's essential to the understanding of the hadith. We have young people in this country now, as you no doubt know, who think that they can derive the fiqh directly from that rather appalling translation into English of Sahih al-Bukhari.
Right.
If you have a Quran in English and Sahih al-Bukhari in English, then if you want the answer or fatwa, you just open it to the relevant page, pull out a hadith, and there you go. Whereas, of course, anybody who tried to do that in a traditional Islamic state would immediately be hauled before the qadi and given 20 lashes for his cheek.
Exactly.
And yet this is how Islam is developing now. They think that's the correct procedure. But do you think there's any hope? I mean, what would be your advice if you were confronted by, say, a keen, intelligent 18-year-old Muslim in England who wanted to study the deen? What would be your counsel?
Oh, well, this happens to me a lot, is that people come to me because, and really my education, I think, you would certainly admit this as well, is that really, our educations have been extremely limited, but because we've had some background in an age where many people have had none or even less, that it might appear impressive to some people, but I feel very impoverished in terms of my own Islamic education. One of the things Ibn al-Hajj says is about knowledge is that not only do you have to have a sound teacher, but you have to have a long life too. Is it's almost one of the prerequisites for acquiring the knowledge of this teaching because it's so vast. But people do come to me and say, I really want to study Islam, what should I do? For us, I think when we became Muslim, because we became Muslim similar, you became Muslim what year?
79.
So, okay, I became Muslim 77. And I think we hit just the beginning of this. The Iranian Revolution was just happening in 79. There was just a lot of changes, transformations in the Muslim world. It was very easy to live in many Muslim countries. As a Muslim, there was no threat about going to the masjid. Having a beard was not problematic. Studying, these type things. Unfortunately, because of the politicized atmosphere that exists now in the Muslim Ummah, and really what's happening there is kind of like the 60s in America during the Vietnam War, where universities ended up being kind of war zones. Ideological war zones, and this is what's happening in the Muslim world. And unfortunately, unlike America, where you have, although it's it's certainly got its own internal structures that are rather totalitarian, but nonetheless, Kent State was one of the few examples where somebody was actually shot, whereas in the Muslim world, we're dealing with some very ruthless tyrants and dictators and secret polices and these type of things that deal with people with impunity and really aren't too concerned about what the public opinion might be about how they deal with dissidents and these type of things. And the other thing, it's unfortunate that I think that students become dissidents, because I think although it's absolutely important to have our own moral and ethical perspectives and understandings, for a student who's set out on the path of knowledge, they have to commit a good amount of time to that. And the abstractions of the world, which have always existed, we can become caught up in the world. I mean, the Muslims have been for over 100 years now in massive turmoil, political turmoil, and it's very easy to get caught up in these things as youth. But if somebody's actually committed to learning something to be beneficial to the, to the ummah, this is what we're talking about. So unfortunately, I think in the Muslim world right now, in most of the countries, it's a very politicized atmosphere. I think there are still some sheikhs, like you mentioned, one of the frightening things is that they are getting old. When I was in Mauritania 10 years ago studying, I was in a town there called Gero, which is well-known, traditional town of the dominant tribe there is called Tijikanit, and a very scholastic and spiritual tribe. When I was there was about 11 or 12 brilliant fuqaha, Malikiya ulama, that had madrasas. When I went back, I think 9 had died, and you could see the results of their deaths in the village, which was one of the most impressive places I've ever been to. Going back there last year, I was really shocked to see the disintegration that had taken place in just such a short time. Young people listening to Michael Jackson, and I mean all of this madness going into a place that had really been preserved. So I'm taking a long time to get to this, but I really think one of the most important things for us at this stage is to develop institutions within the West. This is an imperative that really we don't have an alternative. We must develop. I think there's now an experiment going on in France right now. There's kind of an attempt to do this. I don't know much about it, and I don't know how successful it's going right now, but there is a modicum of freedom in the West that enables people to set up institutions and study and do these things. Unfortunately, in the vast majority of the Muslim world, that freedom does not exist. And Islam, and particularly the quote-unquote Islamists, are a major threat to a perceived threat. I think a perceived threat to the both the interests of the West as well as the governments in the East and North Africa and these places. So for an 18-year-old right now, I think what I would, if they're unmarried and if they're able to, then I think there are still some places where they can go if they're committed to at least 6 years. I think anything less would be, I mean, there might be some benefit in going less and not learning Arabic, but I think we need people that really are committed. And I want to emphasize at this point, I really don't think, and I think you probably agree with this, the goal of Islam is not to become an alim, quote unquote. It's certainly a wonderful achievement and one of the higher callings, if not the highest of all callings. But many of the ulama were not the ulama. Many of the Sahaba, for instance, they were not the ulama, they were not scholars, but they were people that what they did know, they acted wholeheartedly on it. They had absolute sincerity. Khalid ibn Walid was not a scholar, he was a warrior. That was the gift that Allah gave that man, and it manifested. Abu Dhar was an ascetic and a deeply spiritual Muslim who was an inspiration to anyone who saw him, and that was what he did. Abu Huraira was a scholar. He was a hadith scholar. This was where his...
He wasn't a mufti, was he?
He was not. Yeah, Abu Huraira is not one of the muftis. Ibn Mas'ud was a mufti, as well as being a scholar and a judge. Umar ibn al-Khattab was a judge. He was and a brilliant scholar. Sayyidina Ali is, of course, one of the greatest, the shining monuments of intellectual achievement. Historically, the first intellectual of Islam, as he's been called, because he was just such a profound thinker, as well as being a deeply spiritual person. Aisha was a great scholar. She was not only a scholar in Islamic matters, but she was a scholar in Jahili poetry. She knew the lineages. Just a remarkable woman, and a remarkable human being. Setting aside her femininity, she's a remarkable human being. Anyone, male or female, that achieved what she would achieve would be, honored equally.